You're listening to Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast, where we dive into holistic nutrition, biomedical treatments, functional medicine, low toxicant living, and developmental strategies with a special focus on children with complex picky eating, developmental delays, and neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm your host, Shandy Lasky, integrative speech-language pathologist, pediatric feeding specialist, functional nutritional therapy practitioner, and Epidemic Answers certified health coach. Together, we are changing the conversation around how we view, discuss, prevent, and treat these childhood epidemics. I am so honored to have your time and attention today. Thank you for joining me and for all of your support. Please note that this podcast is for educational purposes only and should never be misconstrued as medical advice or a replacement for individualized care from your trusted providers. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast. As you've seen from the title, in today's episode, I'm going to be covering traumatic brain injuries, leaky brain, leaky gut, and complex picky eating. If you're new to the topics of gut health and leaky gut and the importance of gut health, I encourage you to pause this episode and go back to listen to episode 6, how gut health impacts your child's health and development, before you listen to this one fully. If you're brand new to these topics, I just think it's really important. Episode 6 is more of a foundational level knowledge for you for this one to build on, and the pieces will fit together a lot better. The content in today's episode is introductory level knowledge, but I am somewhat assuming that you have that introductory level knowledge on gut health already, generally speaking, before going further. So if you don't, again, go back, check out episode 6 to learn more, and then come back to this one. Today's episode is going to be a bit different, and by different, I guess what I mean is that traumatic brain injuries, or I'll also say TBI or TBIs to abbreviate, this is not a topic that I am speaking about within my content often, other than some shares here and there of other people's posts, maybe in my Instagram stories as it relates to the information that I share. So for those of you who may be new or new-ish to me and my work, if this is the introductory, podcast that you've found me on, as the introduction of this podcast shares, my work focuses on children with complex picky eating and children with developmental delays and neurodevelopmental conditions. I work with families via distance coaching using an integrative parent coaching model to incorporate holistic nutrition, mealtime, development, and lifestyle strategies into their daily lives to improve their child's overall health, wellness, and development. While there may not be a major demand for this episode specifically, I believe that that's mostly due to the lack of awareness around these connections, which we're going to cover today. This episode was inspired by members of my community, though. I have a couple families who I realized were following along with my content, and they were longer term members of my online community, and I realized that they were there specifically for the complex picky eating content, and that a TBI was unfortunately part of their family's story. And when it comes to TBIs and picky eating, this is the perfect example of why I use the word complex when I'm sharing about my work in this realm of picky eating. So when I learned that there were multiple families already within my community that this topic could potentially serve, I knew I wanted to cover it, even if it wasn't a super high demand topic. I also have fellow professionals and providers who listen into this podcast, and so if that's you, thank you for taking the time to learn and grow with me and expand your knowledge to, further support your clients and your patients with this knowledge. I'm honored for your time and your support. I created this with families in mind and with providers in mind, and I hope that this content reaches whoever it is meant to reach. So if you could help me out, please share this with someone who you feel could benefit from this information. That would mean the world to me. This podcast as a whole, not just this episode, applies to children, but I think that you'll also find this information valuable for teens and adults as well, as long as you keep in mind how what I share could manifest or present as if we were discussing an adult versus a child. So often the same underlying mechanisms that we cover here, they may very well apply, but the way that the symptoms are displayed may be different because children and adults carry themselves differently. And also need to mention that everyone is a unique bio-individual. And so that's their starting canvas. So when you add the brain injury on top of whatever their total load, their allostatic load, their body burden, whatever term you want to use to refer as, but that like total load, that body burden, that's their starting canvas. Then you add the brain injury to that. Well, then you've added another very unique component, because not all brain injuries are the same, and not everyone's underlying total load and, genetic predispositions and all of that is the same. So everyone's going to be impacted biochemically, bio-individually. Excuse me. And it's not going to impact everybody the exact same way. So I'm going to speak very generally for our purposes in this episode, but I want you to be thinking about how it could vary case by case. In episode 4, is your child's picky eating a developmental phase or more complex issue? I shared what I call my complex picky eating paradigm, which is a Venn diagram with 5 overlapping circles. Please picture it. 5 overlapping circles in this Venn diagram shaped like a flower, representing the complexity and the overlapping nature of the causes underlying complex, more severe types of picky eating. And these categories are behavioral environmental as one, with a backslash. They work together. Biochemical nutrition, also one. Medical, structural functional, and trauma. I created this Venn diagram specifically for my online course that I'm working on for you all called Naturally Navigating Picky Eating. It is a labor of love and a work in progress. I will continue to keep you updated. We're getting closer and closer, you guys. It was meant to be this quick course that I just whipped up over a year ago, and it has turned into so much more. As I got going in it, I just realized that I couldn't just half do this course, that it was so much more complex that I wanted to dive deeper and deeper, but I realized it's like one of those things where, what do they say? You're too close to the knowledge sometimes to realize the value of it. I sometimes forget how much of my knowledge is because this is my career path rather than common knowledge. And so the more and more I started diving into it, the more I realized this needs to be more in depth and more of an experience and more of a roadmap. So anyways, it's been a labor of love. And this Venn diagram that I created for the course was really meant to represent complex picky eating and how multifaceted it is. And if you're interested in being on the VIP list to be the first to know more about the course and as we get closer, you can just go to speakingofhealthandwellness.com and download my free Nourishing Picky Eaters guide. I've also linked it in the show notes below for quick access as well, but that'll put you on my email list. So you'll get updates there, as well as throughout the podcast, I'll be talking about it. And as we get closer, I'll be talking more and more about picky eating. But anyways, so what that Venn diagram is meant to do is demonstrate the underlying factors and how complex picky eating is multifaceted, and highlight that if the causes are so broad and so varying, then the way that it is addressed has to be uniquely tailored to that child and family. The reason I bring this up, though, is because I want to take the opportunity to use the complex picky eating paradigm to discuss how a child or individual who is experiencing complex picky eating following a TBI could potentially fit within this paradigm. And I want to use this as an example of how we can use this complex picky eating paradigm to understand each child's unique underlying reasons for their complex picky eating. So that course, Naturally Navigating Picky Eating, that I mentioned, will continue to elaborate on more complex cases using this paradigm, but also give action steps and strategies to follow based on where the child fits or falls within the paradigm. Okay, so let's get into the details of it all as it relates to TBIs, leaky brain, leaky gut, and picky eating, and all of those connections. There's quite a bit to cover, and I'm going to cover it first by laying some foundational knowledge and then really tying those pieces together and building onto that foundational knowledge, as I find myself saying a lot here on this podcast. Okay, so obviously you hear trauma in the categories of complex picky eating, of the complex picky eating paradigm that I shared, of those 5 categories. And you know, if we're exploring picky eating and traumatic brain injuries, then that's probably where we're going to start in the paradigm. So TBIs are most certainly a type of trauma that can truly impact all levels of the person, not just on this physical, medical level, but also very much on a emotional, behavioral, so much more of these different levels. And we also know that TBI would largely fall into that medical category of the picky eating paradigm as well. But by the end of this podcast, my hope is that you see the connections in how it also would then overlap with nutritional and biochemical, and with the behavioral factors that are seen in picky eating. So it's like it spirals into that Venn diagram, but it starts off as trauma or medical, and then it turns quickly into that more, okay, now this has become a nutritional biochemical situation, and now we're seeing the symptoms of that, which are behavioral and otherwise. So that will come together a little bit more by the end of this podcast here. But think about that in terms of, okay, if you're thinking about that Venn diagram, that child, you're never just in one category of complex picky eating. It's multifaceted, it's overlapping, and one category may be more dominant than others, or, there might be a few that are more dominant than others, of course. But it's always very multifaceted and overlapping, and the longer it continues, oftentimes the more complex in nature it can become, and the more involvement across those categories of that complex picky eating paradigm there are. So on that note, regarding trauma, traumatic brain injuries are traumatic not only for that individual, of course, but it's also traumatic for the loved ones as well, on a emotional level of involvement. And because of the nature of this topic, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, and just acknowledge that this is a heavy topic, and I am trying to be very graceful and mindful about how I approach it from a provider's standpoint. And as a new podcaster, I am still fully wrapping my mind around the fact that you could hear this episode when I release it, or you might hear this episode years from now, and in your life and in your journey, it might be fairly recently or after, or perhaps a long time after a loved one of yours, or perhaps your child, or even yourself has sustained a traumatic brain injury. And if this is you, I want to welcome you specifically and thank you for pushing play today and learning with me. And I want to acknowledge what you've been through and what your loved one has been through. I want to acknowledge it's not easy, and it's especially not easy to then take on anything extra sometimes. And I acknowledge that even just the simple action of pushing play and listening to a podcast, it may be extra. So I'm honored that you've taken the time to listen today, because I have created this with you in mind, and I'm glad that you have found it. I also want to acknowledge the fellow professionals again. Thank you for taking the time as well. Let's do a brief overview of the overall nervous system for today's purposes. So when I say for today's purposes, I don't mean I'm going to do an overall nervous system review. I mean I'm reviewing enough of it for today's purposes, okay? So this is going to be a very skim the surface nervous system overview. So let's get into it. The central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord. If you're thinking about the body as a whole anatomically, we're thinking located centrally is your brain, and then extending down from it is your spinal cord, right? Okay, so then we have the peripheral nervous system. These are the nerves that branch out from our central nervous system, branching out from the brain and the spinal cord to other areas that are not central but rather peripheral in the body. So think of the central nervous system as the trunk of the tree and the peripheral nervous system as the branches of the tree. The branches really do depend on the livelihood of the trunk of the tree to sustain themselves and operate functionally, just as the peripheral nervous system of our nerves that send the messages to our limbs and to our internal organs of our bodies. These messages rely on the central nervous system to originate, organize, execute, and relay those messages from the brain to the body, to pass the messages to the peripheral nervous system from the central nervous system, and then back vice versa. So we're getting bidirectional feedback from our brains to our bodies, and from our bodies to our brains, from sensory information and external stimuli, and etc., internal and external, based on factors in our outer and inner worlds. So then falling within the realm of that peripheral nervous system are two branches: the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Somatic guides our voluntary movements that are intentional. So right now, if you could see me, I am really moving with my hands right now. And, you know, I'm talking, these are intentional movements, right? These are intentional. My brain is sending that signal to make intentional movements, while the autonomic branch is, as it sounds, is guiding those more involuntary automatic movements that you do without really thinking about it. So your heart keeps beating, your digestion, for example, keeps on moving. You're just living while the autonomic system is running in the background without much thought to it. Amazing, right? Amazing what the body can do. Within this autonomic nervous system is what you'll hear referred to as the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest state, versus the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight states responses. The parasympathetic nervous system is where you need to be for the body to do its regular maintenance work, while the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response, is supposed to be tapped into specifically when you are in a threat, when you are trying to escape. Your body, like when you need to put the body's general maintenance on hold and survive. If a human needed to escape a lion, a tiger, a bear, oh my, or some other threat, we could go into that hyperdrive escape mode and run away, and that's that fight or flight. And our hope is to get out of there, right? And so it increases your heart rate, and it's meant to be a survival mode. Also, within this autonomic nervous system is what's called the enteric nervous system, which is starting to become more commonly known, but has traditionally been less commonly talked about, and it's housed within our gastrointestinal tract. So again, I want to put another plug here. If you haven't listened to episode 6 about gut health, this is another time where I'm highly encouraging that you do, to learn more and understand more about that enteric nervous system a little bit more in detail. But essentially, it is a branch within the autonomic nervous system. It's an autonomous nervous system in its own right as well, this enteric nervous system. And by that, I mean that it can function autonomously without the central nervous system always telling it what to do. Like the other branches rely so much on the central nervous system, the enteric nervous system has some autonomy. And it does, and it can communicate with the central nervous system, and in various ways it does rely on the central nervous system, but it has much less codependency on that central nervous system than the other branches that we covered. It communicates with the central nervous system via the other branches of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. This enteric nervous system is becoming more commonly known as our second brain. And that's because it's layers and layers of neurons, of nerve cells lining the gastrointestinal tract. And like I said, it has autonomous actions that it can do with reflexes and things like that. It plays a large role in peristalsis. I feel like I always say that word wrong. Peristalsis. But basically the peristalsis is the term that means the movement of our chewed food from our mouths and through the digestive tract. It's the relaxing and the contracting of our muscles in the digestive tract to move it through. So there's a lot more to our nervous system as a whole than what we just covered, like I said. But let's move on now and come back to our main focus now that we've laid some major groundwork down. Now, let's be sure to also cover the difference between eating disorders and feeding disorders, just really quick. Because while I focus on children, TBIs can be common in teens. So sometimes it's not always looked at like a feeding disorder. It would potentially be looked at as an eating disorder. But really, in my mind, it would be more neurobiological and biochemical, so it would fall more within that realm of a feeding category. But anyways, just let's cover this really briefly. So essentially, an eating disorder is viewed more like a mental health condition. It's more in that realm, and there is generally a component of body dysmorphia within that demographic of individuals with that diagnosis. Typically, eating disorders are more common among teens and adults, while feeding disorders are seen as more of a developmental condition and would typically be more commonly seen in younger children. But it can happen at any age if there is this major event that occurs that would then lead to a feeding disorder potentially. But feeding disorders are not mental health conditions. They are more so related to difficulties with the skill of eating, related to structure, function, the ability to eat that food in some capacity, whether it's biochemical or, like I said, structure, function, sensory motor, what have you. As a feeding specialist, I'd be considered an expert in pediatric feeding disorders, but not in eating disorders. Now, that being said, I do know that there is a very interesting link biochemically between those who have anorexia and young children with complex picky eating who I serve, and that is a zinc deficiency. So a zinc deficiency is very, very, very common in individuals with anorexia and individuals with severe picky eating. So that's just something to think about. I'm not saying that makes it not a mental health condition, but I'm just saying, is there anything that really truly is purely 100% just a mental health condition? I don't know. I feel like if we're looking at it that way, are we isolating the brain away from the body? Are we saying that the body can't influence the health of the brain? Because I believe that it does, and I believe that it's not just the children that I'm talking about all the time, but I believe that it's for everybody, that's applicable to everybody. So, again, it's just something to think about. That's just something that I wanted to add here. And the reason I bring this up is because when it comes to TBI, the eating difficulties and the challenges may not seem related, so they may not be connected. Like, for example, if a high schooler gets a concussion or, a TBI, and thank goodness they're, mostly okay, but then they, in the months that follow, develop different mood issues and different, just different issues, and within that happens to be what appears to be an eating disorder. Well, then for me, I would say, okay, let's check their zinc status, and is it possible that they are impacted by what we're about to talk about, which is that leaky brain, leaky gut, these secondary effects from the TBI, but it may go unrecognized, right? And so it's, if you just don't know what you don't know. And so I'm just hoping to increase the awareness here. So it may not seem like it's connected, but it may be. So we would want to ask questions, again, going back to this teenager, we would ask questions like, okay, is there body dysmorphia involved? How involved? Was that the case before head trauma, or did this just happen after? Is there a possible zinc deficiency or otherwise another deficiency? Was there recent brain trauma? Are there food sensitivities, intolerances? These are questions that need to be asked so that we can get them to the appropriate care and plan some strategies that are tailored to them. So if it's not a mental health condition, it should not be treated like a mental health condition, regardless of how old the individual is, whether this is a child, a teen, an adult. Bottom line, if it's not a mental health condition, it should not be treated like a mental health condition. And with the presence of a TBI, we can say that it's not purely a mental health condition, most likely. So now I want to touch on leaky brain, leaky gut. So usually we hear the phrase leaky gut, leaky brain, which basically refers to how when we develop this intestinal hyperpermeability, referred to as leaky gut, as more damage continues to accrue, this barrier of our digestive lining, which shouldn't have been breached, is now breached by invaders, letting them into our bloodstream for systemic circulation. These are things like proteins that should have been broken down into amino acids for proper absorption and assimilation. But now they're, larger whole proteins that aren't going to come into contact with the enzymes and what would be needed to break them down. So now they're free floating in the bloodstream, setting off immune system responses and different things. Other things that could be in the bloodstream would be other undigested food particles, not just proteins. Pathogens, virus, bacteria, different things. These things that were not supposed to be in the bloodstream. They were supposed to move out through our digestive tract and out the other end. But because of that intestinal hyperpermeability, it moves into our bloodstream, where it then migrates to damage the blood-brain barrier, which is a similar lining of cells that lines our brains. Because the cellular linings between our gut and our brain are very similar, much of what causes the leaky gut can permeate or cause damage to the blood-brain barrier, which is sometimes why you see these major cognitive and behavioral symptoms after a child eats or drinks something that doesn't react well with them. So that's the leaky gut, leaky brain connection. And that's what most people are familiar with when they think about gut health, right? Like that's, at least for me, I know that's the connection that I was more familiar with. But what is less commonly talked about is the opposite, which is leaky brain, leaky gut. Research in animals, animal models, as well as humans, has demonstrated that within hours of a concussion or traumatic brain injury, the lining of the gut can become leaky or more hyperpermeable. The trauma to the brain and that major communication route between the brain and the gut, the vagus nerve specifically, and other routes of communication, various ways, all of this releases these chemicals and mechanisms within the body that create this hyperpermeability between the cellular tight junctions of the gut lining. And this brings me now to what is referred to as secondary brain injury. So first, so primary brain injury, as you can imagine and expect, is the first impact of trauma to the brain, right? It is what's done at the time of impact. The secondary brain injury refers to the damage to the brain that may occur following that primary brain injury. So we're talking the hours up to the days that follow that primary brain injury. There's a response happening within the body that is going on biochemically, trying to bring the body back into balance, but potentially, depending on what's going on, again, we're thinking back to that, that like total load of the canvas and what was going on with this person before that TBI, that matters. Like, that really does matter. If someone has a really imbalanced gut before the brain injury even happens, they are going to be more susceptible to the potential of this secondary brain injury because of the biochemical responses that are going on in the body. So what we're thinking about is there more damage that is accumulating somehow physiologically at the molecular levels, the cellular levels, somewhere in there in the anatomy and physiology that's causing this secondary brain injury or potential for a secondary brain injury. I found this really interesting review in the Journal of Brain Sciences titled "A Review of Traumatic Brain Injury and the Gut Microbiome: Insights into Novel Mechanisms of Secondary Brain Injury and Promising Targets for Neuroprotection." That's the title. But I want to share a direct quote from their abstract directly because I think that it's worded really well, that just kind of like further puts this concept into perspective. So this is a direct quote. "The gut-brain axis, a communication network linking together the central and enteric nervous systems, represents a key bidirectional pathway with feed-forward and feedback mechanisms. The gut microbiota has a central role in this pathway and is significantly altered following injury, leading to a pro-inflammatory state within the central nervous system," so the brain and the spinal cord. "Herein, we examine traumatic brain injury in relation to this axis, the gut-brain axis, and explore potential interventions which may serve as targets for improving clinical outcomes and preventing secondary brain injury." Basically, this study was examining different therapies and strategies that were aimed at improving the health and integrity of the gut microbiome and the gut lining and the enteric nervous system to support the central nervous system overall. So they were supporting the enteric nervous system to then support the central nervous system, therefore the overall nervous system and the body's health, wellness, and functioning. Isn't that amazing? I truly love this stuff. It's so fascinating to me because it really offers so much hope that can come from this information. So like, I took a TBI class, a traumatic brain injury class, that was an elective during my master's degree becoming a speech-language pathologist. And this was not something that I learned. And again, this is like, when I say that, I don't mean that to fault the institutions that provided me with my education. But I say that because I don't want you to think that this is common knowledge. If you're like, well, why didn't my provider ever tell me that? Well, it's because it's not common knowledge. And so here we are, increasing the awareness. And now that I've learned it, I just feel called to share it for families and for professionals as well, because imagine how many families it could help if it were more common knowledge. Because remember, the central nervous system is central. It is the boss of the central nervous system, or of the nervous system overall. I mean, the central nervous system is the boss. So if it's in a state of inflammation now, and then, then we need to think about what we can do at the surface level with diet and lifestyle that could then overall lower the burden on that central nervous system, and in turn hope to lower that pro-inflammatory state. And we can do that by directly targeting our gut microbiomes and our enteric nervous systems that work autonomously and have a bidirectional communication system with the central nervous system as well. Anything that could negatively impact your gut microbiome could then in turn be impacting the central nervous system. That goes for everyone, but we're talking specifically about individuals who have experienced head trauma and therefore gut trauma, and now they are more likely hypersensitive beings to their environments in a variety of ways. So foods that they may have been eating may now cause sensitivities. Products that may have been fine to use around them before may trigger them now, whether that means they get a headache or behavioral symptoms, or they are lethargic, or they get a scratchy throat, or they're just, whatever. It could be different for different people, but they are more likely to be sensitive beings to their environment now. So now we're back to thinking about this as the gut-brain connection overall, but with more of a sense for this bidirectional relationship from the opposite perspective, stemming back to that brain injury response. Now, if you have made it this far and you're new to the subject, I do still encourage you to go back and listen to the gut health episode number 6, because all of that information would now work perfectly inserted here, right now, at this point in the episode, as well as episode 7, which is titled Gluten-Free, Casein-Free Diets, Picky Eating, Autism, and Other Neurodevelopmental Disorders. What's the connection? Because if your child has experienced a TBI and now experiences complex picky eating, this episode, episode 7, and then those that follow it, episodes 8, 9, 10, are absolutely applicable here with this gut-brain connection involvement and picky eating involvement. But to summarize it again, because of TBI, this individual is more susceptible to being sensitive to foods and different environmental exposures and stimuli. So how exactly then does a TBI impact or exacerbate picky eating? There are so many ways that we are biochemically and neurobiologically impacted by traumatic brain injury. But as we've covered, there's this connection via the gut and the brain and the gut. There's the enteric nervous system and the gut microbiome. And then there's also leaky gut, this intestinal hyperpermeability, which is where the intestinal lining is hyperpermeable, little bitty holes, letting through things that should not have been let through. It's now letting them through. So now we have to think about what that really means long term. Again, episode 6, go back and listen to this information, please, if you're new to it. But the long story short of it is this. Now the individual who has the TBI, experienced the TBI, who is more susceptible to food and environmental sensitivities, these food sensitivities, environmental intolerances and sensitivities, such a mouthful, these will continue to create inflammation within the body via the immune system's response, which is connected to our central nervous system. It's a neuroimmune type of connection. And some food sensitivities also create an autoimmune response through molecular mimicry, not all but some. And meaning that the body starts reacting to those food proteins that should have never been seen in the bloodstream. And perhaps to the body, they start looking like the protein of a certain organ or a certain tissue, like your thyroid gland, for example. So the body sets off this autoimmune response sending the immune system after these food proteins, and then in the process accidentally is turning against your body's own proteins because of this molecular mimicry. Gluten is often a major culprit for this. I cover food sensitivities and food intolerances way more throughout episodes 6 through 10, so please refer to those previous episodes. In addition to these immune system sensitivities, there's also an increased risk for food intolerances, which are more so related to the digestive system's ability to process and assimilate that food. It's less to do with the immune system and more to do with the digestive system. That then creates some sort of adverse reaction. You may see this behaviorally or cognitively through attention-focused behavioral issues, but you could also very well see this through appetite. And they very may well become seemingly like addicted to certain foods, where they're experiencing extremely strong biochemical cravings to certain foods for various biochemical reasons due to these sensitivities and intolerances. When I first learned about leaky brain, leaky gut, it was actually from my boyfriend. He had taken a continuing education course, and the doctor that he was listening to was an expert in traumatic brain injuries. And he knows that I'm fascinated with gut health and the brain, and that I'm gluten-free. And so when he came home, he shared, hey, did you know that people who have TBIs are basically like immediately sensitive to gluten? And I can't remember what my immediate reaction was to that, but I bet my jaw dropped because, to be honest, I had not even thought about it. But at this point, I understood the gut-brain connection and leaky gut, leaky brain, and TBIs from, my experience in just as having a background in speech-language pathology and taking this course in graduate school. And I don't specialize in traumatic brain injury, but I have worked with clients who have had traumatic brain injuries. And so at this point, I knew enough to like connect all of the dots, but I had not even thought about it. So when he said that, it was just like, whoa, that makes so much sense. But I needed to understand more about the fine details of it all. And it's been very fascinating to learn about, especially because in kids, well, and in adults, but you see these after effects that really go overlooked because they're not always connected. And sometimes that restricted eating or that picky eating and food sensitivities and food intolerances, that's very much commonly overlooked in this demographic of children and individuals. A sensitivity to gluten can cause a strong craving to gluten-containing foods, which is then it can create these downstream issues for these children and individuals who are experiencing this leaky gut, leaky brain, vice versa, and they already have this systemic inflammation response going on. So, we want to be mindful of that. And I feel like it's important to know that, hey, these individuals, their body's like working overtime now to help heal them. So if there's something that we can do to take the burden off of that, shouldn't we be looking at that? If we now know that their immune system and their body is going to very likely be triggered by gluten, if we know that it's going to exacerbate this leaky gut, leaky brain, leaky gut, shouldn't we talk about that a little bit more? Shouldn't we explore that a little bit more? Again, it's like I don't want to fault anybody for it because doctors aren't trained in nutrition, and it's just this whole like system issue. You know what I mean? But we need more awareness. So here we go. And again, please go back episodes 6 through 10 because it just puts all these pieces together more and more. Another biochemical relationship that we have to keep in mind as it relates to picky eating and traumatic brain injury as well is their blood sugar regulation. So individuals who have experienced traumatic brain injury are also going to be more susceptible to being more sensitive to the rises and the dips of blood sugar regulation. And so when a child is eating a lot of simple carbohydrates, simple carbs, think like your white foods, white starchy foods, fall apart foods, refined flours, refined sugars, processed foods, not a lot of nutrients in them, right? They might be getting a lot of calories, but they're not getting as many usable nutrients. And this matters because our cells are, we think about calorie intake for like energy output, but our cells are made from nutrients. Our cells and our bodies are literally regenerated based off of the food that we are giving it. So these foods that I mentioned that are spiking blood sugar, these can create changes in mood and behavior. It can make kiddos look hyper or silly or rambunctious or, not very focused, like they're not listening, just out of control maybe sometimes. And then the opposite, where they then may crash or come down and they are lethargic or moody or tired. They're melting down. They're tapped out. They're just totally done and over it. And sometimes to get themselves back up again, they crave those carby, starchy, processed foods, high sugar foods, highly refined foods, sugary drinks, things like that. Maybe even sometimes the kiddos who are like nonstop on the fruits, even these high glycemic fruits especially. These are the kiddos, they also may graze all day, but perhaps they don't want to eat at meal times. Something that we can do to support this is really working to present a balanced mealtime at each time that they eat. So even snacks look like little bitty meals where you're offering a fat, carb, and a protein option, because the protein and the fat is really going to help the body slow down the process in which those carbs break down and create that blood sugar rise. So if you add protein and fat, it slows it down a little bit. The other option is that you could go more towards those complex carbs from whole foods, rather than crackers and chips and cookies, like looking at carbs from fruits and veggies and things like that, like looking at whole foods. Something that we can do to support this is working to present balanced mealtime options, pairing these foods with that are more likely to spike blood sugar, pairing them with a protein and a healthy fat option, and aiming to eat a balanced meal every 2 to 2.5 hours. And when it's a snack, aiming to make it look like a mini meal, essentially, not just a carb option, but aiming for a fat, carb, protein, a little mini meal as a snack. So we could start with breakfast and work from there, because as they say, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. This might look something like, instead of a muffin or a bagel or cereal, right, which these are those more, those carbs that are going to spike blood sugar because of the way that they are processed and broken down, or like a on the go breakfast bar type of deal, it's just like pure carbs, right? And so those carbs will break down into sugar, they spike blood sugar. So how can we either add in some fat and protein to that mix, and then slowly like transition over. So you could aim, like long term, aim for something that looks more like eggs or a little homemade breakfast patty with some avocado, and maybe it's avocado toast or something like that, and fruit or some veggies like cherry tomatoes or a few slices of bell peppers to jumpstart the day and to set up that blood sugar regulation on that right note, to not only put it in place for that blood sugar regulation to support focus and learning behavior, but also to increase the satiety longer. So when you start off your day with these carby foods like a bagel or a muffin or a Pop-Tart or a grab-and-go breakfast bar or whatever, you'll find that whether it's you or your kiddo, and whether there's been a traumatic brain injury or not, most people, it sets their blood sugar to be like up and down all day, because then now they just want to grab for like quick fix snacks type of foods throughout the day to give them that immediate blood sugar rise to help them, come back up. So this kids and individuals with traumatic brain injuries are also more susceptible to being sensitive to their changes in blood sugar regulation. Think about it like this. Even after the major trauma is over and the individual is, and I'm doing air quotes here, back to functioning day to day, they are likely still going to experience some symptoms that might be related back to their TBI, whether it looks related or not. And whether it looks related or not is going to really depend on the symptom itself and then how much you know about TBIs. But their bodies are always, our bodies are always working for us. Their bodies are working very hard to lower that inflammatory response. Their bodies are working very hard to support their optimal function. Their central nervous systems control so much of their overall health and functioning. So let's do what we can to support their central nervous system through food, diet, and lifestyle. If your child has developed picky eating following a traumatic brain injury, there could be a variety of components involved, but you definitely want to consider the gut-brain connection as well as the involvement of blood sugar regulation. When it comes to the gut-brain connection, I'm not just talking about simply adding in pre- and probiotic foods to improve microbiome health. Although those can be very helpful for some individuals, it's really important though that we're taking a look at what foods and environmental exposures could be influencing that overall inflammatory response with that involvement of that gut-brain connection. This includes food sensitivities, food intolerances, most commonly food dyes, food additives, artificial flavors, etc., found often, essentially always in most common processed foods, the standard American diet, but also they're commonly sensitive. Many of the kiddos and individuals who have had traumatic brain injury can become sensitive to the protein gluten. Gluten is the protein group that is found in wheat, barley, rye, and other gluten-containing grains, and casein, the protein found in dairy products. These are the most common, but any food really can become potentially a trigger that would cause a reaction for someone. It's all bio-individual. And that's why it's important to explore these connections for your child with a professional or professionals, a team that can help support you, especially if your child has become a complex picky eater or has developed complex picky eating secondary to experiencing traumatic brain injury. I really highly encourage you, once again, please listen to episodes 6 through 10 leading up to this, if this feels like I am talking to you in this episode. If you need further support tailored to your child and family's needs, please don't hesitate to check out my distance coaching options on speakingofhealthandwellness.com. If it looks like you and I might be a great fit to work together, I would be absolutely honored to speak with you to see if I might be the right fit to support your family. You can learn more about my distance coaching options and schedule a complimentary discovery call with me on the site, which I will link in the show notes as well. Lastly, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this has already gotten relatively lengthy. And, you know, I've touched on a lot of strategies in those other episodes because we kind of came full circle back to leaky gut, right? And food intolerances and food sensitivities. And in this episode, I really wanted to just highlight those connections between traumatic brain injury, leaky brain, leaky gut, and picky eating and those connections there. And I think that we have done that in a very surface level, introductory level terms, right? Like obviously this goes so much deeper and we can look at this in a much more like medical and scientific perspective, but I wanted to come at this in a very like introductory and practical sense where, okay, this has given you perspective that your child's picky eating it's not only related to the traumatic brain injury, but it's related to the traumatic brain injury through this leaky brain, leaky gut, leaky brain connection that creates these intolerances and sensitivities and immune system responses and so forth, which creates this low level inflammatory response, which is then not helping the central nervous system, which is now working overtime to support and heal the damage that has occurred from the traumatic brain injury. So, it's a lot. But like I said, there's a lot more strategy and practical like action steps housed within episodes 6 through 10 if this is something that you are interested in exploring more. But one other thing that I wanted to touch on regarding traumatic brain injuries and picky eating, but also just like overall, I want to mention primitive reflex integration. And when you have a traumatic brain injury, you are more than likely going to have reflexes that come out of integration. And this may be totally a foreign concept to you and unfamiliar to you, and that is okay. I hope to elaborate on this in the future, hopefully bring on some experts and some guests to further elaborate on this, but really fascinating stuff that I learned about when I was working in early intervention. I cross-trained with this physical therapist who was just like above and beyond as a therapist. She was just amazing. And she took this incredible training for primitive reflex integration called MNRI. And then she cross-trained us, not fully. She didn't like completely redo the training or anything, but she gave us like introductory levels of information to really think about how these reflexes set up development and regulation and how they tie in just so hand in hand with the central nervous system. And so anyways, with brain injuries and damage to that central nervous system, while nutrition and lifestyle can be super helpful for support, right? In addition to traditional therapies that and other integrative therapies that someone might use, those can all be very helpful. Different movement therapies and techniques that focus on primitive reflex integration and neuroplasticity are worth looking into. What comes to mind specifically for me, again, is MNRI for primitive reflex integration and the Anat-Banil method, and that's Anat-Banil, A-N-A-T, Anat-Banil, B-A-N-I-E-L, Anat-Banil method for movements for neuroplasticity. I'm not going to explore that too much more now here, but if you have the capacity to explore this in addition to diet and lifestyle, which we've talked about, I highly do encourage that as well, because I think that's really important too for individuals who have experienced traumatic brain injuries. This will be really helpful for integrating these reflexes, balancing the central nervous system, and then therefore hopefully bringing down that overall inflammation response as the body works hard to heal after TBI, which then also helps with improvements in overall sensory and motor systems, which then can impact and improve development and regulation and this complex picky eating. And so it all really goes hand in hand. And yeah, it's a lot. I feel like I just gave a whole lot of information. I feel like we could have gone on longer and longer, but I just, I hope that I did this topic justice. I hope that this gives you some clarity and starting points and strategies that you can start to implement today at home, whether your child or loved one has just recently had a traumatic brain injury or whether some time has passed. I think that this can be important and valuable at any stage. Obviously, it would be more helpful the sooner the better. But say that a year has passed or years have passed, it's possible that your loved one or yourself may still be experiencing these dysregulations with this leaky brain, leaky gut, leaky brain, and this connection that not only is contributing to picky eating, but also could be contributing to other symptoms like headaches and sensory distortions and dysregulations and different motor issues or just different things, different GI disturbances. There are a lot of different ways that this could manifest. So my hope is that this episode will find its way to those who need it the most. So like I said before, if you are taking a listen here and you know that someone else in your life might benefit from this information, whether it's a parent or a provider or a loved one of yours, please send this further. Help me spread this information further by sharing this with them. It would mean the world to me, and it could potentially help them with their overall health and wellness. And that is so what I'm here for. And yeah, I would be honored. So anyways, thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. I hope that this episode has served you and supported you. If you resonated with this, come tell me on social media, in our Facebook group. Leave me a message on iTunes. That would mean so much to me as a new podcaster. It makes a world of difference to really boost the algorithm of the podcast if you are reviewing it. So you can do the stars if you want to, or you can leave an actual comment, which would just make my heart so happy. But anyways, you guys, I hope that you have a wonderful remainder of your day. and a fantastic remainder of the week. Take care, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks again for listening to Speaking of Health and Wellness, the podcast. I'm so grateful you've taken the time. For any of the references mentioned in the show, head over to speakingofhealthandwellness.com. If this episode resonated with you or inspired you, it would mean so much to me if you took a moment to subscribe, write a review, share it on social media, or with someone in your life who could really benefit from this information. Your support helps this podcast and the overall message and mission of Speaking of Health and Wellness reach more people. If you share on Instagram, tag me so I can personally thank you for listening. If you're on Facebook, come join our free community group of like-minded parents and professionals. The direct link is in the podcast description. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again so much, and take care.